Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Dr. Tom DiLorenzo about the problems with socialism. Dr. DiLorenzo is professor of economics at Loyola University Maryland and a faculty member at the Mises Institute. He is the author of The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, Hamilton's Curse, How Jefferson's archenemy betrayed the American Revolution and what it means for Americans today, and, most importantly for today's discussion, The Problem with Socialism. You can follow his work at lewrockwell.com, that's lewrockwell.com, and at Mises.org, that's MISES.org. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/socialism. Tom, welcome back to the show.
I'm pleased to be with you guys.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. So since we'll be discussing socialism today, let's start out with a definition. What is socialism?
Well, it has several parts to it. One, the traditional definition is government ownership of the means of production or government-run enterprises. And then it evolved to also include income redistribution by the government through the welfare state and the progressive income tax, with the same goal of egalitarianism or pursuit of material equality. And then the third part of it, as Ludwig von Mises said in his famous book, Socialism, is what he called destructionism. That is, the attempt to destroy the private enterprise system with excessive taxes, regulations, inflation, whatever can work. So that's what I include in my definition of socialism.
Okay, and building on that definition, what are some of the issues you cover in your book?
Well, the first thing I do is discuss in plain language some of the reasons why socialism has always and everywhere been an economic catastrophe and the biggest generator of poverty the world has ever known. And there's the incentive problem, where when people get paid the same, regardless of how much or how little they work, they don't have much of an incentive to work. Then there's what's called the knowledge problem, which is the recognition that what really makes the economic world go around is all the widely dispersed specialized knowledge that we all have to do our jobs. We all specialize in something, and we make money at it in the market economy, and then we buy things from other people. It's called the International Division of Labor and Knowledge in the language of economics. And the big pretense of socialism is that a small handful of politicians could possibly have in their minds all of this information that millions of people have that they use to go about their daily work lives and make the economy work. And that's one of the reasons why socialism never did work. The third reason has to do with prices. Market prices determined by supply and demand give us very important information. They tell us about the intensity of consumer demand for products. They tell us about the supply situation. If things become in shorter supply, they become more expensive, and that the higher price tells us it's time to conserve, time to cut back, time to look for substitutes. And it tells businesses it's time to invent substitutes and find substitutes for the things that are getting more expensive. And so prices are kind of like street signs in a city. It's impossible to have a workable economy without prices. And any government that has tried to impose prices by dictate has created disaster. And that's on display today in Venezuela, which adopted socialism in 1999, and they've totally destroyed their country. And that's just one of the things that I introduce in my book.
So you talked about the three big ones, the calculation problem, the knowledge problem, and the incentive problem, and how a lot of those can't be solved with central planning. But what are some of the other problems with central planning in general as a way of trying to decide what's best for the community and the economy?
Well, it eventually destroys democracy and destroys civil liberties, because what happens is that the government plans inevitably fail for the reason I just gave. But governments never admit failure, or they rarely ever admit failure. And what they do instead is to give themselves more and more power. And they try again and again and again with newer and bigger plans, which are, destined to fail for the same reasons. And whenever government has more power, that means you and I and everyone else has less freedom and less prosperity at the same time. And so that's what government does under socialism. And also, the whole idea of socialism is the imposition of one big government plan or a series of plans on the whole society as a substitute for the plans that we all make for our own lives. And so you can't have dissenters to that. You can't have people all going about having their own plans. If you want a government-run healthcare system, for example, you cannot also have competition from a privately run healthcare system. That's why Obamacare is on the road to destroying the private health insurance industry altogether, very obviously. And so that means the governments tend to crack down on free speech, civil liberties, and any source of opposition. And there's a wide range of that. In our country, we have political correctness and crackdowns on free speech and things like that, to the opposite extreme of the Soviet Union and their brand of socialism, where they engage in the mass murder of tens of millions of people, their own citizens, for merely dissenting against socialism. And I quote some scholarly books on this in my book. One of them is called The Black Book of Communism, and the other one is Death by Government by R.J. Rummel. And it's very depressing, but it's something that people who are interested in this topic need to know.
And one of the things that's brought up all the time is, these plans are made by the experts, right? We have the experts in government, and the experts aren't outside. And if we just have all the smart people come up with a plan, individuals don't need their own plans. What's the problem with that and this idea of the experts?
Well, the experts, one problem with that is there's no such thing as unbiased experts. Anything government does is guided by politics. And so whenever you put the government in charge of any plan for any industry, for example, it's going to benefit the politically connected members of that industry and the politicians at the expense of everybody else, just because of politics. And then also you've got the pretense that the so-called experts could know, as I said earlier, what is in the minds of all the millions of individuals in society, and somehow, incorporate that into their plans, which they certainly cannot. And so what we always get whenever we get government in charge is what's called crony capitalism, government of the one percenters, by the one percenters, for the one percenters. And you see that everywhere. You see it in America. You see it in Venezuela, socialist Venezuela today, while middle-class people who used to have very good jobs are rooting through garbage in the streets looking for food to eat. You can read on the internet that the wealthiest person in the whole country in Venezuela is the 35-year-old daughter of the late Hugo Chavez, who is reportedly worth $4.2 billion with a B. And so the politically connected always will do well in a socialist system. Friedrich Hayek, the famous Austrian school economist, once said that under socialism, the only power worth having is political power. People will not educate themselves in how to produce things, how to engineer things better, how to get prices down, and how to serve customers. They will educate themselves in how to be good liars, manipulators, and deceivers. And those are the tools of politics. And the people that are the best at that will rise to the top under socialism and any other big government system.
So I want to return to some of the main problems with socialism that we discussed earlier, and of course the calculation problem is right in there. Ludwig von Mises wrote about this in his book, Economic Calculation, the Socialist Commonwealth, and you've explained some of this already, of course, but people might think, well, weren't there prices in these socialist countries? And of course there are some sort of prices that someone sees when they go to a store in these socialist countries. But can you explain exactly what the calculation problem is and how that looked to the ordinary person?
Well, of course there were prices, but when prices are just determined arbitrarily by politicians, there's no economic reality behind them. They don't reflect scarcity. They don't reflect the intensity of consumer demand. And so they don't really tell us anything about how to go about making economical choices, whether in our lives as consumers or as businesses. For example, one of the things that von Mises wrote about was the big problem is how to go about producing goods and services in a market where you don't have prices determined by supply and demand, Because for a car, for example, there are probably over 2,000 different parts to a car. And so how do you decide which type to use? Well, whatever's cheapest, just like anybody else does. But if you don't have prices determined by the reality of supply and demand, then you have no idea how to go about producing a car or anything else in the most efficient way. And in today's competitive global economy, that's economic poison. You can't have a well-functioning economy without prices at all if you don't do that. And so that was one of the things that von Mises said was probably the biggest problem with economic calculation. There's no way to calculate profits and losses in a real sense without real market prices. And what profits tell you, by the way, is if you get $1,000 worth of raw materials and labor and you create a product with it and you sell the product and you end up with $2,000, well, then you have added value. You've added $1,000 in value. But without market prices, you have no idea whether you're adding value or destroying value. And so that's the economic calculation problem.
And it's interesting because whenever we think of prices normally as consumers, it's just, well, how much is this going to cost us? So it takes a bit, sometimes I think it takes a bit of thinking to really, instead of looking at prices of just, oh, this is how much this costs me, and thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if the government just set all the prices really low, then everything would be cheap and everyone would be happy. Sometimes it takes that next level of thinking to think about what the prices mean and really that they're a measure of something more than just cost.
Well, right. Well, look, I mentioned Venezuela, and the government did what a lot of governments do and try to make itself popular by decreeing low prices of food and everything else. And they decreed that the prices would be so low that it was no longer profitable for anybody to be in the food business. And as a result, the grocery stores are empty. And hundreds of thousands of people have left the country just to look for food. Animals are starving in the zoos. People are abandoning their pets because and the government of Venezuela has stated that it wants to order people to spend 60 days at least a year working in the farms to produce food. And so that sort of Soviet-style totalitarianism is what price controls in Venezuela. Democratic socialist Venezuela, I would add, has resulted in.
So one of the other problems that we talked about initially was the knowledge problem. So let's go into a bit more detail about what is the knowledge problem and why is it important that we diversify knowledge throughout our economy?
Well, it's just the recognition of economic reality. The way I talk to my students in my classes about it is I announce to them that the students in this class, and there might be, say, 35 of them, I tell them they could not possibly produce a pizza by scratch. And they think I'm crazy when I first say that because they think, well, I could just go buy a pizza shell at the grocery store and then pizza sauce, tomato sauce, and there you go, got a pizza. But no, when you say by scratch, you mean the first thing you have to have is a wheat farm, and you have to grow wheat in order to, and then you have to have a mill that mills the wheat into flour, because then the flour can be made into dough. And just the wheat farm alone requires an enormous amount of technology and know-how and capital equipment. It requires the petroleum industry to refine gasoline out of petroleum in order to move all the vehicles around that are used on modern farms and to transport all the food to the market and so forth. And that's just for the pizza dough. And so just for that requires a lot of detailed knowledge of probably hundreds or thousands of people, maybe all over the world, just for the wheat industry and to produce bread or pizza dough. And so, and that's a simple thing like a slice of pizza. So it requires all that knowledge to provide us with the simplest things. And of course, people acquire that knowledge in pursuit of their own self-interest, to make money, to support themselves and their families. And that's the famous invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, that, how is it that we get our wheat and our bread and our milk and everything else? without any central planner ordering everybody around and telling us how much bread and how much milk we are to have, was people pursuing their own self-interest and making the best use they can of decentralized knowledge. That's what makes the economic world go around. And so, students in my classes could not make a pizza from scratch. It requires an enormous amount of information. And that's the knowledge problem. Hayek called it the pretense of knowledge, the idea that a small handful of politicians could possibly make better use of all that information, or even if they could possess it in their minds, which of course they cannot.
Well, and of course, Leonard Read talked about the knowledge problem in his essay, I, Pencil, where he is portraying the perspective of the first-person perspective of a pencil and going into detail about having to plant the trees and then get the wood from the trees and account for the rubber on the eraser and the little thing that holds the eraser to the rest of the pencil, and then accounting for the graphite. And that's just not possible for any one person or even a small handful of people to have the knowledge base that's necessary to go through all these stages of production and all these processes that lead up to the creation of even just a simple pencil.
Yeah, that's right. I think someone updated that famous essay in the Freeman, the magazine of the Foundation for Economic Education, some years ago, and I think they had 66 different ingredients of a common pencil. And even titanium, the paint that goes on the outside of the pencils, is that titanium dioxide is the main ingredient. And so you need the whole chemistry industry involved just to make a simple pencil. And that's, I try to use an even simpler example with my pizza example, but that's the original example of this, is I, Pencil by Leonard Read.
Yeah, so let's move on to the incentive problem. Can you explain in a little more detail what the incentive problem is, and then explain why there still were people who worked in these socialist or communist regimes despite the lack of incentives, and what that looked like in the classic socialist and communist cases?
Well, again, I'll use how I explain it to classes of introductory economics students at my university. I tell them that if we were to adopt socialism in the classroom, that I would give them exams all semester long, and then I would add up all the points earned by all the students during the entire semester, and then I would divide that number by the number of students, and everybody would get a C, get the same grade, equality. And so it's obvious to them immediately that they would have no incentive to study, because if you got a C, whether you studied 0 hours per semester or 100 hours per semester, why would you study 1 hour even if you get the same grade as far as that goes? And so, yeah, there might be a few people who would be outliers and do some studying just because they enjoy it or for whatever reason, but it will kill the incentive of most of the students to do anything. And the same is true for any kind of industry or job there. And, even there's this famous story of when Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States and was taken on a tour with President Kennedy, and President John F. Kennedy was bragging about the productivity of the American automobile industry compared to the Russian automobile industry. And Khrushchev himself said, well, everybody knows you can't get production without incentives. So even the socialists of the 20th century understood this problem, but they were all about control. It didn't matter to them that they were ruining their economies. They wanted to control everything. They were totalitarians after all, and that meant more to them than creating prosperity for their own people.
Now, we've talked a little bit about how socialism can create this economic disparity between those who are connected to the political elite and those who are not. But often we hear a lot of Today we hear a lot of people saying how capitalism is what causes all this inequality, and capitalism is bad. And it's not just misconceptions that socialists have with capitalism. I think there's lots of misconceptions that even self-proclaimed capitalists have about capitalism. So what are some of these misconceptions, and why are they wrong?
Well, the biggest ingredient to the decline in inequality is markets and capitalism and economic growth. For example, we had very rapid decline in the rate of poverty in the United States after World War II until about the late 60s and early 70s, when we started exploding our welfare state and paying people not to work, basically. And then at that point, our success against poverty stopped and reversed itself, and the poverty rate went up. And so what was going on all during that time was a sharp decline in income inequality, due almost entirely, 100%, to economic growth, job growth, and increased economic freedom and economic opportunity. If you want to get people stuck at the bottom, then you put them on welfare. We have many, thousands, maybe millions of people whose families have been on welfare for generations now and are pretty much stuck there at the bottom. In Hawaii, for example, there was one study that I cited in my book that said people who qualified for just 7 welfare programs out of more than 100 that they're eligible for can get up to $49,000 a year in welfare benefits in Hawaii. And the least generous state is Mississippi, but still that's about $18,000 a year. And so you'd have to get a pretty good paying job as a person on welfare, especially in Hawaii, to have an incentive to get that job. And so we sort of get people, we force them to be stuck on welfare, even if they would like to become financially independent. Who can blame the single mother with children for not taking a minimum wage job when she can make $25,000, $30,000 a year or more in money and benefits like subsidized housing and child care and things like that from welfare? And so that's how you get people stuck at the bottom, put them on welfare. But capitalism has always been the great equalizer.
And I think one thing you said was very telling, and that's we had a decrease in poverty before we started enacting all these programs. And that's really not what we read in the history books, and it's not really what we're taught in school, right? We're always taught, well, things were horrible, and then we had the war against poverty, and now look, poverty is way lower. So it's very interesting.
We had the war against poverty, and poverty won. I cite the book Losing Ground by Charles Murray, who has all the relevant statistics in it of what I just talked about, of how we had a very sharp decline in poverty in the post-war era. And it's very striking that as soon as the so-called Great Society welfare programs kicked in the late 60s and early 70s, progress against poverty, the poverty rate had been going down very sharply for a long time, all of a sudden shot straight up in the air, and the poverty rate just went up and up. And it makes perfect sense because we started paying people for not working in a very big way. And so, whatever government subsidizes, we get more of. And if you subsidize not working, you're going to get more people not working.
Right, and of course, income inequality issues and poverty issues are far worse, tend to be far worse in socialist or communist countries, because in those countries, by and large, economic success is based on being a part of the elite, being connected to the Politburo, being a part of the crony system at the top of that society, and less about economic activity and production. And this really further goes to show a difference that needs to be made, a distinction that needs to be made between cronyism and actual capitalism. And this is a distinction that socialists and critics often miss, but it's very key and very important to understanding exactly what's going on.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not that difficult to understand. I think a lot of the socialists intentionally lie about this. They know that economists, free market economists like myself, for generations now, have been repeating Adam Smith's warnings. Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, was a big, fat critique of what today we would call crony capitalism, but he called it, in his day, it was called mercantilism. It was government policies that benefited producers, basically at the expense of consumers and everybody else. And so free market economists like myself and the Austrian school economists have been criticizing that for generations. And the socialists know this, but I think they intentionally try to make people think that this is all capitalism is like this, and there's no such thing, nor should there be such a thing as a genuine free market. And so I think I've come to the conclusion it's totally dishonest. It's not just a matter of a mistake or miseducation, because it's not that hard to understand. There are thousands of critiques of people who make money through political connections rather than the honest way of producing better goods and services on the market.
Right, and of course, real capitalism allows for anyone in society, even the poorest, to participate in the economic process in an honest way, in an entrepreneurial way, in a hard work, strong work ethic sense, and be able to rise and to improve their economic condition and their economic situation. But I want to take a step back here because I've been using this term communism, and we haven't defined it yet. So what is communism, and in what ways, if any, is it different than socialism?
Well, the Soviet Union, the title of their government, the name of their government was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was not the Union of Soviet Communist Republics. And so the 20th century socialism was socialism. Communism was this utopian ideal that they claimed that they would achieve someday in the future, but they never did. And so, for the practical world of communism, we called them communists. It was socialism. It was the same thing. And so I guess what you could say is that a communist is a socialist who's in a big hurry. We might have socialists in the United States like Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, but they don't want to mass murder dissenters and things like Stalin and Lenin and the rest did. They're not in quite as big a hurry as some of these other monsters were to adopt socialism.
Sure, and also what was Nazism, and how did that differ from socialism, and how was that the same as socialism? Because a lot of critics of capitalism will say that Nazism was somehow connected to capitalism, but that really seems to be incorrect. So can you demystify all of this and explain exactly what it was?
Yeah, chapter 6 of my book is called The Socialist Roots of Fascism. And after all, the word Nazi means National Socialism. It was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And so all the fascists were socialists. The Germans called themselves National Socialists to distinguish themselves from the International Socialists in Russia. But they all called themselves socialists. And Nazi Germany nationalized about half of all industry. And the rest of all industry was so heavily regulated, controlled, and regimented by the Nazi government that it was de facto nationalized. And so that is not at all anything remotely like capitalism at all. It was a version of socialism. And the German business people who supported the Nazis were fools. They were fools if they thought they could make money in a system like this more than they could in a free market capitalist system. And they were eventually taken over and controlled by the government of Germany. And also, I cite in my book, the ideological or philosophical underpinnings of capitalism are known as classical liberalism. The ideas of freedom, free trade, free markets, private property, peace, and so forth. That's liberalism. And I quote Mussolini himself from his own autobiography as understanding that his enemy, the enemy of fascism was classical liberalism. And he even used the words classical liberalism in his attack on it. And he specifically attacked the ideas of Adam Smith and the free market ideas of Adam Smith, and which he denounced as sort of the British propaganda, and John Locke and the ideas of natural rights and that inspired the American founding fathers, or some of them anyway. And so they understood that their enemy was classical liberalism, private property, free markets, capitalism, and that their alternative was a version of socialism. That's what fascism was from an economic perspective.
So a lot of times we hear the word socialism thrown around, and we think, oh, well, socialism is something that happened in, like, Soviet Russia, or socialism is something that happens in other countries, Venezuela. It doesn't happen here. Can you describe some ways and some socialist programs that we have here in the United States and why they're ultimately harmful?
Well, yeah, you look at all the government-run enterprises at the local level, government-run power plants and water companies, and all these things. Obamacare is a version of socialism. And so, we have a lot of that. And so if you look at taxes at all levels of government in the U.S., federal, state, and local, they comprise almost 40% of national income. And so by that measure alone, you could say that the U.S. economy is almost 40% socialist. And if you add on top of that the fact that we have 75,000 pages of fine print regulations in the Federal Register, which lists all the federal regulations of American businesses and individuals, then you can make a case that we are about at least half socialist already, and that government controls that much of the economy, either through regulation or outright ownership of the resources. And so, we're a very long way down the road to socialism. It's always been a matter of degree, and we're not quite at the pace of galloping socialism, but socialized medicine certainly moved us in a big way in that direction. And that wasn't just Obama. President Bush did a lot for that when he expanded Medicare to cover prescription drugs. That was a boost to socialized medicine as well.
Sure, and of course we've also seen an increase in people in the United States who call themselves socialists. A lot of them might use the term democratic socialists, but there's still a tremendous increase in self-proclaimed socialists in the U.S., and this was happening even before the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, but the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign has done a lot, of course, to increase the number of self-proclaimed socialists. So why are we seeing such a tremendous increase in the number of self-proclaimed socialists, and what does that say about the direction the U.S. might be headed in?
Yeah, well, I think one reason is that the people who used to call themselves Democrats or liberals have taken their masks off now. They always were proud socialists. And I think politicians like Hillary Clinton have emboldened them to just throw in the towel and no longer hide behind this facade. And then you've got a lot of younger people, the millennials, who voted for Bernie Sanders, who I think just don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what socialism is really. They never studied it. There was no one at school who ever taught them about it or taught them about markets and capitalism for that matter. And they like the idea of being offered free stuff by politicians. And they don't seem to understand that there is no such thing as a free lunch and that nothing is free. And those are the main reasons I think why we're seeing this in our society today.
Sure, and before we wrap up, a few more questions for you. And one of them is relating to the Scandinavian countries and the style of socialism that's practiced there. Because a lot of the time, that's presented as sort of a middle-of-the-road option between full-on free market capitalism, or even not so much capitalism, but the U.S. system, and what happened in the Soviet Union or in Maoist China. So what's the truth about the Scandinavian socialism, and is it really sort of this wonderful middle ground? What's the story there?
Yeah, well, like democratic socialist Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil, Scandinavia, especially Sweden, calls itself democratic socialist, or at least everybody in the world seems to. In the case of Sweden, Sweden was a limited government, low tax, high economic freedom society in the late 19th, early 20th century. They created great entrepreneurs like Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite, and the people who created Volvo and Saab automobiles in Sweden. And they had the highest per capita income growth for about 60 years in the late 19th and early 20th century until they adopted socialism. In the 1950s, they began nationalizing industries. They established a huge welfare state, high taxes, progressive income tax, and a heavy regulatory regime of the remainder of their capitalist system. And as a result, they did not create a single net new job in Sweden from 1950 until 2005. That's 55 years of no job growth in Sweden. So they basically lived off the capital created by earlier generations of entrepreneurs and capitalists. And that eventually came to an end in the late 70s and 80s. And the Swedish government tried to bail itself out by printing large amounts of money, as socialist governments always do. And they ended up creating 500% interest rates in Sweden. And that led to a revolt where they privatized a number of their big industries, deregulated banking and telecommunications and a lot of others, and moved more in the direction of capitalism, and that saved them for the time being. But they still have a per capita income lower than Mississippi, which is our poorest state. And so democratic socialist Sweden is hardly a role model for America.
Another country that's often talked about and on the opposite end of the spectrum is Venezuela. And we've already talked about it briefly, about all the troubles they've been having. But how severe is the problem there, and how did that come about?
Well, Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez, who was elected, democracy in Venezuela, and he was a socialist, promising a socialist paradise and lots of free stuff to people, price controls. He was going to set prices low and everything, and give a lot of stuff away, a lot of big welfare state. And of course, they have almost as much oil in Venezuela as Saudi Arabia does. And so they were able to use their oil revenues to subsidize a big welfare state and government giveaways for a while. But because of the inevitable failures of socialism, his nationalized industries all began to fail, even petroleum, or especially his petroleum industry. And the price controls have created utter chaos in the Venezuelan economy, where the store shelves are literally empty. And you can read articles on the internet of people who used to have good jobs, as I said earlier, literally rooting through garbage in the streets looking for food to eat. And the economy has been ruined. It took about 15 years to totally ruin the Venezuelan economy. And Venezuela used to be the wealthiest Latin American country because of all the oil resources they have. And so if a country like that can be ruined in 15 years, just about any country can be ruined by socialism in fairly short order.
Well, it really is remarkable, and perhaps just as remarkable is the fact that these ideas have been around for quite a while now, and they're increasing in popularity despite a horrible track record. Of course, we've seen proponents of socialism in the U.S. for decades. There were all sorts of Westerners and Americans going over to the Soviet Union and making comments such as, "I've seen the future, and it works." And of course, Henry Wallace, a vice president under Franklin Roosevelt, was very fond of the Soviet system and was a socialist. So this problem has been around for a while, but it seems to be getting worse. In many ways, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon has underscored just how much worse it's been getting. So what can people do to push back against socialism, and what can be done to stop this socialist direction that things seem to be headed in?
Well, the first thing they should do is read my book and then buy copies for everyone they know. That's I encourage them to read it. and they can listen to your podcasts. And, people have to educate themselves. I found myself that with some of my students in the last semester who are Bernie Sanders supporters, until I pointed out to them that I don't work for free, I'm not a slave, and neither is anybody else at the university. So how could it be that higher education could possibly be free? And they looked at me as though no one had ever brought that point up to them before. They never thought of that before. And some of them sort of eventually decided that they've been taken as fools by politicians like Bernie Sanders promising them something for nothing. Once they understood the economic laws of opportunity cost, that there is no such thing as a free lunch or free anything else. And they also understood that this big national debt that we have is on them. They're the young generation. They're going to be starting their work lives soon. And this giant tax bill is going to be their tax bill for the debt that has been used to finance the American welfare warfare state for the past couple of generations. And they don't like it. And so I think education is the key.
Well, and just how prevalent are socialist ideas throughout academia and throughout higher education? We're seeing cultural Marxism run amok in academia, but just how bad is it? How bad are the economics that are being taught in higher education? And just how strong is this force that we're up against in the world of academia?
Yeah, well, as far as economics goes, economics is probably the least objectionable discipline as far as this goes, because even the Keynesians, even the interventionists in the economics profession, when they write textbooks, if you were to read Paul Krugman's textbook, he lays out supply and demand, how markets work, how the minimum wage law prices low-skilled workers out of jobs, just like all the other books do. And so even if you take a course with a textbook by a Keynesian interventionist, you'll still learn something about how markets work. And so you can listen to your professor denounce markets, but at least you'll get an understanding of how they work, and you don't have to agree with them for the rest of your life. And so, but it's the social sciences and the humanities outside of economics, though, that are the most infected by political correctness, cultural Marxism, and just leftism and socialism in general. And it really is dominant, and they really are cracking down on free speech. You know, whenever you hear a university administrator say that we do not tolerate insensitive speech or anything like that, what they really mean is conservative or libertarian ideas. Because it's not as though college students are a bunch of racists and bigots that are out there spouting bad language like that. You know, that's the impression they would give you. What they really mean is conservative and libertarian ideas are to be cracked down on, not vulgar, bigoted speech. I've been a university professor for 35 years, and I can count on one hand the incidents of that sort of thing that I've actually personally heard on college campuses. You know, especially today. Today's students are very, very well mannered in my, at least in my university, but my university still issues these warnings as though, these students are at any moment are about to blurt out some sort of vulgar racist epithet somehow, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it definitely is. So you obviously mentioned your book, The Problem with Socialism, as being a great way to fight back, reading that and educating yourself by reading The Problem with Socialism. And we've mentioned a few other titles over the course of this interview: Economic Calculation, The Socialist Commonwealth, and Socialism by Ludwig von Mises. We mentioned I, Pencil by Leonard Read. Is there anything else that you recommend someone read if they want to learn more about socialism and about what we've been discussing today? And what are the best ways to follow your work in particular?
They should start reading the articles on Mises.org on a daily basis, MISES.org and LouRockwell.com, and read some of the books by Murray Rothbard. He was sort of the godfather of libertarian economics in the 20th century. And so read his essay, Anatomy of the State. It's a real eye-opener, and that would be a good start. And I think if you go from there, you'll discover all sorts of other literature that is very enlightening.
All right. Well, I definitely agree that Anatomy of the State is an eye-opener and well worth reading. It definitely caused me to reconsider some of the preconceived notions and some of the premises I'd been operating under, and I'm sure that's been the case for many others. So that's a great essay, and I encourage everybody to check that out. And I, of course, encourage everybody to also go check out the show notes page for this episode. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/socialism. And, of course, we will link to The Problem with Socialism in multiple places. We want it to be as easy as possible for people to find their way to that book and to access it and figure out how to read that book. So there'll be links to The Problem with Socialism, and, of course, we'll link to Socialism by Mises and Anatomy of the State by Rothbard, and all of these readings and resources that we've mentioned over the course of the interview, as well as your archive, Tom, at LouRockwell.com and at Mises.org. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/socialism is the place to go. The show notes page for this episode with all of those links and resources. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so you can stay up to date with what's going on with the show and make sure to catch every episode and not miss any. And Tom, thank you so much for your time today, for being so generous with your time and helping us to take a look at socialism and explain and explore just why it's such a failure and why it doesn't work at all, and look at all the myths attached to socialism. And we'd love to speak with you again sometime soon.
Okay, thanks for having me on the show, guys, and have a great day.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.